Shabbat shalom. So that was the first paragraph of my drash. Anniversary Shabbat in 2020 was on February 7th, and that's the day that Andy and I moved. So I couldn't give the drash that night. And I thought I'd do it some other time, but it was February 2020, and then it was March 2020, and so things changed. So very happy that, and thankful that Rabbi Kleinbaum and Sabrina are allowing me to do the drash tonight, and to Rabbi Werber for helping me polish it. So this week's parsha is Mishpatim, which is generally translated as rules or laws or judgments. It doesn't tell one of the great Bible stories we heard about in Hebrew school or provide an account of a major biblical figure, despite coming after perhaps the great Bible story, the giving of the Ten Commandments to the Israelites in the desert. In fact, Mishpatim is not much of a narrative at all. It consists almost entirely of a long list of laws and regulations, 53 mitzvot in all, covering civil and criminal matters, social justice, property rights, and ethical conduct. Together, the laws articulated in Mishpatim are often referred to as the Covenant Code. The laws in the Covenant Code run the gamut for how the Israelites should live, the details, if you will, to implementing the Ten Commandments they had just received. Many of the rules are pretty general, even repetitive of laws found elsewhere in the Torah, such as honoring your parents, observing Shabbat, not worshiping false gods. They could be applicable and relevant to any time or place. But some are very specific to the time and place they were given. For instance, rules related to harvests, handling livestock, and other property disputes. A seemingly mundane rule about property disposition is followed by a rule about how to worship God, showing the lack of distinction between everyday life and sacred life for the Israelites at that time. I gave a drash on Mishpatim 6 years ago in my first year as board president. In that drash, I focused on two related points. First, about the very high degree of specific similarity between the covenant code found in Mishpatim and other law codes in the ancient Near East, most famously the Code of Hammurabi, a set of laws promulgated by a Mesopotamian king around 1800 to 1700 BCE, quite a few centuries before the events described in Exodus. So this makes clear to me that the Covenant Code was in fact a set of commonly accepted laws and regulations observed by many ancient Near Eastern regimes, not just the Israelites, edited as needed to suit the needs of specific cultures, but still very much similar in structure and content. And my second point 6 years ago follows the first. As a more generic pan-regional set of laws, the Covenant Code couldn't have been related to the giving of the Ten Commandments, and must instead have been inserted into the Exodus narrative by the compilers of the Bible at a later time to lend them a God-given imprimatur. But this is not to imply that the laws in the Covenant Code are not important or hold no relevance. Indeed, their use across a broad swath of Near Eastern societies, for me, lends them, if not more relevance, then at least more historical interest, as someone who does not read the Bible literally. Tonight, though, I want to focus on a specific rule in the Covenant Code. It is in Mishpatim that we first hear one of the most infamous biblical incantations, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, etc. In Exodus 21:24 in Mishpatim, an eye for an eye is discussed as punishment for someone who strikes a pregnant woman who then dies. A similar formulation with slightly different wording and outcome appears 2 more times in the Torah, in Leviticus 24:20 in another set of rules for the Israelites, and in Deuteronomy 19:21 in Moses' last instructions to Israelites before his death. Are we expected to take the explicit, direct, reciprocal retribution of an eye for an eye literally? In our day, many people do exactly that to argue, for example, in favor of the death penalty. Much as this direct, severe retribution does not sit well with us today, it hasn't felt right to others either. Both Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. both rejected the direct retribution implied by the literal interpretation of an eye for an eye as cruel and vindictive. And in Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye says, if everyone lived by an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, the world would be blind and toothless. The rabbis of the Talmud were also not comfortable with the seemingly severe reciprocal retribution suggested by an eye for an eye. As they often do, the Talmudists developed a curative interpretation to the severity of an eye for an eye. It doesn't mean they teach the literal taking of the perpetrator's eye or tooth or foot or hand. If they did, they reasoned, predating Sholem Aleichem by a few centuries, how would society punish a blind or toothless criminal? Rather, they say, it specifically means not the taking of a body part, but rather monetary compensation of equal value, not just for maimed body parts, but for any sort of crime. But this interpretation doesn't sit perfectly well with me either. It feels as if they also knew that an eye for an eye was too harsh and perhaps bad for the Jews to require such harsh treatment. I prefer to interpret an eye for an eye as preventing excessive and unequal punishment, rather than as requiring monetary compensation as the Talmudists would. In Mesopotamia and other ancient Near Eastern societies, rules were needed to prevent disproportionate retaliation, an asymmetrical response in modern warfare terminology, and to assure that all people of their societies were treated equally. One noted difference between the Mesopotamian rules and the Israelite rules is the equal treatment of all. In Mesopotamia and other societies, the upper class and powerful were exempt from some rules or subject to different outcomes, while in Israelite society, they were not, at least not on paper. As I researched this parsha again, preparing for my drash, I found it difficult not to read the Covenant Code through the lens of the Israel-Hamas war and the horrors of October 7th and the horrors in Gaza. The literal interpretation of an eye for an eye might support killing and destruction for the murders, rapes, and kidnapping that Hamas committed on October 7th. This is seemingly supported by another rule of the Covenant Code, in which God promises to kill Canaanites, Hittites, Jebusites, and other peoples inhabiting the land to make way for the Jews. But the context for this rule, as I read it, is to prevent the Israelites from worshiping the gods of those other peoples, to only worship Adonai, not as payback for anything those people did to the Israelites. My interpretation of an eye for an eye, prevention of excessive and unequal retribution, would have led to a more measured, strategic, and less violent response to October 7th. But as we know, that is not what has occurred. I fear that another part of the Covenant Code will come to haunt the current Israelites. Quote, "You shall not mistreat widows or orphans. If you do, I will hear their cry, and my anger shall make your own wives widows and your own children orphans." I pray for peace, and I pray that a misguided interpretation of an eye for eye creates no more widows or orphans in Israel or Gaza. Shabbat Shalom.